My name is Daniela Navarro. I am 26 years old, and I spent the first 24 of those years believing that if you worked hard enough inside a family, the family would eventually see it. I was wrong. My father, Ernesto Navarro, built Navarro Property Group from a single rental duplex in Tucson, Arizona into a mid-sized commercial real estate firm with 11 employees and a client roster that included 3 regional developers and a handful of private investors who had been with him since before I was born. He was proud of this in the specific way that men of his generation are proud of things they built alone, which is to say he referenced it constantly and credited almost no one. The office was a converted Victorian on the east side of Tucson, pale yellow with dark green trim, and my mother, Renata, handled client relations from the front suite while my father ran acquisitions and closings from the back. I had a desk between them in what used to be a sunroom. My title on the door placard said Administrative Coordinator. What the title meant in practice was that I handled contracts, scheduling, client correspondence, escrow timelines, and anything else that fell between my parents' 2 defined lanes and didn't get caught. I had been doing this since I was 19, first as a part-time favor during college, then full-time after I graduated with a degree in business administration from the University of Arizona. My father had not suggested I apply anywhere else. He said the firm needed someone reliable and that reliability was something he trusted in me. I took this as a compliment for 2 years before I understood it was a description of furniture. My older brother Marco was 29 and worked in acquisitions alongside my father. He had no real estate license. He had a habit of showing up 40 minutes late to client walkthroughs and explaining it as traffic, even on Saturdays. My father found this charming in the way he found most things Marco did, completely and without condition. Marco had my father's jaw and my father's laugh and an easy confidence that rooms rearranged themselves around. I had my mother's handwriting and a color-coded filing system that had never once lost a document. If you have ever been the person in a room who does the thing that makes the room run, and you have watched the room run smoothly and heard no one mention why, you already know exactly what I am about to tell you. Sit with me for a moment, because this next part matters. The anchor object in this story is a leather portfolio. Dark brown brass clasp, monogrammed with the initials EN, my father's initials, a gift from a client the year the firm turned 15. My father kept it on the credenza behind his desk. He used it at every closing, every investor meeting, every presentation that mattered. I had replaced the legal pad inside it 11 times over 4 years. I knew the weight of it in my hands the way you know the weight of something you have carried without being asked. I want you to remember the portfolio. The incident I think of as the first one, the one that named the pattern before I had a word for the pattern, happened on a Thursday evening in early March, roughly 8 months before everything changed. My mother had scheduled a dinner meeting at the house with a client named Warren Pruitt. Warren was 61, a semi-retired developer from Phoenix who had approached my father about a potential partnership on a mixed-use parcel in the Rincon Valley. He was particular. My mother had described him in the calendar note as detail-oriented, which was her professional way of saying that he had called the office 4 times in 1 week to ask about the survey addendum on a parcel that had not yet been formally listed. The dinner was set for 7. My parents' house was 12 minutes from the office, a single-story ranch on a corner lot in the Catalina foothills, pale adobe, terracotta tile, a front courtyard with a wrought iron gate my father had bought at an estate sale and installed himself. I arrived at 6:15 to help my mother set up. She had laid out a charcuterie board on the kitchen island and printed a single-page summary of the Rincon Valley parcel, a summary I had written, in a presentation folder she'd bought at the office supply store. The folder was the wrong color. The parcel summary had a formatting error on the second page where the acreage figure had dropped a decimal. I fixed both quietly, reprinted the summary from my laptop, found a navy folder in my mother's office credenza, swapped everything before Warren arrived. My father came home at 6:45. He walked through the kitchen, picked up a piece of prosciutto, looked at the folder and said, "Good. Renata, this looks sharp." My mother said, "Thank you." I was standing 3 feet away. I slid the reprinted copy back into alignment and said nothing. Warren Pruitt arrived at 7:10. He was a large man, broad-shouldered, with the specific kind of deliberateness in his movements that told you he had learned to take up space intentionally. He shook my father's hand, nodded at my mother, and looked at me the way guests sometimes looked at me in that house, like a person trying to determine whether I was the help or the daughter, and landing somewhere between the two. My mother guided Warren to the living room. My father followed. I brought out the sparkling water and the glasses on a tray. Warren settled into the armchair across from the fireplace, accepted the water, and then did something I hadn't expected. He pulled out a yellow legal pad covered in handwritten questions and set it on his knee. "Before we get into the parcel," he said, "I want to walk through the survey methodology. The addendum language is non-standard and I need to understand why before I'm comfortable moving forward." My father looked at my mother. My mother looked at her folder. The survey addendum was something I had drafted based on a precedent document from a 2021 closing. I had flagged the non-standard language in an email to my father 6 weeks earlier and explained exactly why it was structured that way. He had replied, "Kay, looks fine." I was still standing near the doorway with the tray. I said, "Mr. Pruitt, if it's helpful, I can walk you through the addendum language. I drafted it. The non-standard clause is a carve-out for the riparian buffer on the eastern edge of the parcel. It's required under the county's updated watershed ordinance from 2022. I have the ordinance reference if you'd like to see it." Warren looked at me directly for the first time. "You drafted it?" "Yes." He turned to my father. "Is she on the transaction team?" My father paused. Not long, 2 seconds, maybe 3. He smiled in the easy way he smiled when he was deciding how to handle something. "Daniela keeps things organized for us," he said. "She's been a big help." Warren looked back at me. I kept my expression level. "I'd like to hear the explanation," Warren said. I set the tray down on the side table, pulled my phone from my pocket where I'd saved the ordinance PDF, and spent the next 18 minutes walking Warren Pruitt through the addendum clause, the watershed ordinance, the county's enforcement timeline, and the 2 comparable closings I'd found in our own records that had used similar language without challenge. Warren asked 5 follow-up questions. I answered all 5. At the end he said, "That's exactly what I needed. Thank you." My mother said, "Of course. Daniela is very thorough." My father said nothing. He had his hand around his water glass and he was looking at the fireplace. I folded the napkin on the side table into a smaller square and said nothing. Later, after Warren left and I was washing the glasses in the kitchen, my father appeared in the doorway. I thought for one moment that he was going to say something about the meeting. About the addendum. About the 18 minutes. He said, "Next time Warren comes, let me handle the technical questions. It can come across as too much when you jump in like that." I set the glass down on the drying rack. I said okay. He went back to the living room. My throat tightened in a way I didn't have a name for at the time. I stood at the sink for a moment with the water still running. Then I turned it off, dried my hands, and went back to the dishes. That evening was not the beginning. It was just the first time I was old enough and clear-eyed enough to see the shape of the thing. The real beginning was years earlier, somewhere around the time I was 21 and had finished my first full summer at the firm. I had spent those 3 months rebuilding the client database, not updating it, rebuilding it, because the existing system was a combination of Excel sheets, a FileMaker database from 2009 that no one had the login for anymore, and a physical Rolodex my father still used for clients he'd known since the 90s. I transferred 11 years of contact records, cross-referenced every active transaction against the county assessor's database to update parcel numbers, and created a tagging system that allowed anyone in the office to pull a client's full history in under 30 seconds. It took the entire summer. When I finished, I walked my father through the new system on a Tuesday afternoon in August. He nodded through the demonstration. At the end he said, "This is good. Marco, come look at this. Daniela figured out the database." Marco looked at the screen for 45 seconds, said, "Nice," and went back to his office. My father patted the desk twice and said, "This'll be useful. Good job." I had worked 62 hours that week alone. I was not angry exactly, but something close to it had been building for a long time, and that afternoon was the first time I recognized it clearly enough to name it as patience wearing thin. Over the 4 years that followed, I kept a running document on my personal laptop. Not as a formal record, not as anything I planned to show anyone, just as a habit I developed after the database summer, a way of making my own work visible to at least one person. The document was a plain text file. I called it contributions.txt. I added to it when I remembered and sometimes when I needed to remind myself that the things I was doing were real and that they mattered even when no one said so. I had drafted and finalized 37 client contracts over 4 years, every one of them reviewed and sent under my father's signature. I had managed the escrow timeline on the Saguaro Commons closing, a $2.1 million commercial transaction that ran 6 weeks over schedule because the seller's lender changed underwriting requirements mid-process. I rebuilt the timeline twice. I was on the phone with the escrow officer at 7:30 in the morning on a Friday when the final clear to close came through. My father announced the closing at a team lunch and said it had been a complicated one but that everyone had pulled together. Marco was at that lunch. Marco had not been on a single phone call about Saguaro Commons. I had handled correspondence with 6 of the firm's 11 ongoing client relationships, including Warren Pruitt, who had begun emailing me directly after the dinner meeting and whom I had kept engaged through 3 months of due diligence delays without a single escalation. I had rewritten the firm's standard lease template after a property manager flagged a liability gap in the force majeure clause. I found the gap myself first, actually, flagged it to my father, was told it was probably fine, rewrote it anyway, and filed the revised version. 2 months later, the property manager called about the exact clause I'd flagged. The revised template was already in place. I had coordinated the office relocation when the firm's previous lease expired, sourcing 3 options, negotiating the terms on the Victorian, overseeing the build-out of my mother's suite and my father's back office, managing the physical move over a single weekend so that nothing missed a business day. I had covered Marco's client walkthroughs 7 times when he called in late, telling the clients he was delayed and walking the properties myself with a copy of the spec sheet I had prepared for him. The second remembered incident I want to place here happened in the spring of my 4th year, about 14 months before the evening with Warren Pruitt. My father had been invited to present at a regional commercial real estate conference in Scottsdale, a 1-day event, panel discussion format, invitation only for mid-sized operators in the Southwest. He'd been asked to speak about transaction management in volatile markets, which was, functionally, my area of the business. He asked me to prepare his remarks. I built him a 40-slide deck and a 12-page talking points document. I researched the 3 other panelists, identified the questions likely to come from the moderator based on the conference's published theme, and wrote him answers for each one. I stayed at the office until 11:30 the night before he left, printing and binding everything into the presentation folders I'd bought from the same office supply store my mother used. He came back from Scottsdale on a Tuesday and said the panel had gone well. He said another operator from Albuquerque had asked for his contact information afterward. He seemed pleased. He did not mention the deck or the talking points document. 3 weeks later, I found the presentation folder in the recycling bin next to his desk. The binding was still intact. The talking points pages were crisp. He had not opened the document at the conference. He had spoken from memory and done fine, and the 40 slides had sat in his bag the entire day. I pulled the folder from the recycling bin, smoothed the cover, and put it in my desk drawer. I don't know exactly why. Maybe because I needed it to exist somewhere that wasn't the trash. The third incident that lodged itself in my memory from those years happened at a family dinner, not a business dinner, just a Sunday meal at my parents' house, the 4 of us plus my Aunt Cecilia, who visited from San Diego twice a year and who had a gift for saying the thing no one was supposed to say out loud. We were talking about the firm. My father was describing a property he was looking at in the Midtown corridor, a small office building, older construction, good bones but deferred maintenance. I knew the property. I had pulled the county records on it 2 weeks earlier because my father had mentioned it in passing, and I had gotten into the habit of doing preliminary research on anything he mentioned, just in case. I said, the HVAC system is original. That's a significant capital expenditure before any tenant will sign. The county record shows no permit activity on that system since 2007. My father looked at me across the table. He said, "Where did you get that?" I said, "County Assessor's Office. I pulled the records when you mentioned it a couple of weeks ago." There was a pause. My Aunt Cecilia said, "Ernesto, your daughter just saved you from a bad deal. You should be writing her name on things." My father laughed, the easy laugh, the one that meant the conversation was over. "Danny's always doing her homework," he said. "That's why we keep her around." He said it warmly. That was the thing about my father's cruelty. It always came wrapped in warmth, in the register of a compliment, in a tone that made it hard to explain to anyone afterward why it had felt like a door closing. "That's why we keep her around." The words settled into me the way certain things do, not with a sharp edge but with weight. I looked at my water glass and held very still. My Aunt Cecilia watched me from across the table. She didn't say anything else. But she looked at me for a long moment with something in her eyes I recognized later, when I was older, as recognition. The triggering incident happened on a Wednesday in November, 6 weeks after the Warren Pruitt dinner. My father called a firm meeting at 9 in the morning. All 5 of us, which meant my father, my mother, Marco, Pilar, and me, crowded into the back office around the round table my father had brought from his first office when he moved to the Victorian. The table was walnut, scarred on one edge from a moving accident, and my father had never replaced it because he said it reminded him of where he started. He set the leather portfolio on the table in front of him. "I've been in conversation with a group of investors," he said. "Acquisition partners. They're looking at a portfolio play, commercial and multifamily, mixed exposure, Southwest Corridor. They want to move in the first quarter." He described the scope. 3 properties, combined acquisition target around $4.8 million. The investors had their own legal team but wanted a local operator to manage due diligence, coordinate the inspections, and handle escrow. My father had been introduced to them through a mutual contact, a developer named Aldridge from a previous transaction. "This is the biggest coordinated deal we've done," my father said. "I want us all pulling in the same direction." He looked at Marco. "I'm putting you on point for investor relations. You'll be their primary contact through the process." Marco nodded like this was the logical conclusion of something. My father looked at my mother. "Renata, I need you to coordinate the scheduling, inspections, title, all of it." My mother wrote something on her notepad. My father looked at Pilar. "You'll handle the confirmation emails and the client gift package for when we close." Pilar said, "Of course." My father looked at me. I was already holding a pen. I had been making notes since he described the first property, cross-referencing what I knew about Southwest Corridor commercial comps, thinking about the due diligence timeline, noting that 3 properties in one escrow cycle meant we'd need to stagger the inspection windows or risk a bottleneck at the title company. He said, "Daniela, I'll need the office running smoothly while we focus on this. The usual, keep the contracts organized, make sure nothing slips." "The usual?" I looked at him. I kept my expression still. "I can handle the escrow coordination," I said. "I've run every closing this firm has done in the past 3 years. 3 simultaneous transactions is exactly the kind of thing that needs someone dedicated to the timeline." My father smiled. "I know you could, Danny. But I need you here. Marco's going to need backup on the investor side." "Marco's backup," I said. "Support," my father said. "It's a team effort." I capped my pen and set it down. The meeting ended 15 minutes later. Marco shook my father's hand on the way out the door, which struck me as a strange thing to do when you worked with your father every day, but Marco had always had a talent for gesture. I stayed at the table after everyone left. The walnut surface was cool under my palms. I looked at the leather portfolio, still sitting where my father had left it. He had taken his notes on a separate yellow pad. The portfolio was just a prop, I realized, or a signal. A way of indicating that something important was being communicated. I picked up the portfolio. I undid the brass clasp. Inside, a fresh legal pad, blank. 3 business cards from Aldridge's firm. A printed email chain between my father and one of the investors, a man named Gerald Foss, listed as managing partner at a Phoenix-based private equity group called Foss Capital Partners. I read the email chain. Gerald Foss had not been introduced to my father through Aldridge. Gerald Foss had emailed the firm's general contact address 11 weeks ago. I knew this because I managed the firm's general contact address. I was the one who had responded to Gerald Foss's initial inquiry. I had sent him the firm's capability summary, answered his follow-up questions about our transaction history, and forwarded his detailed inquiry to my father with a summary note 3 weeks after the initial contact. My father had described this introduction as coming through Aldridge. I read the email chain again slowly. Then I set the portfolio down on the table exactly as I had found it, brass clasp refastened, positioned at the same angle. I walked back to my desk. I opened my laptop. I found the original Gerald Foss email in the general inbox, 11 weeks ago, a Tuesday, 9:47 in the morning. My response was below it. And below that, my forwarding email to my father, with a 3-paragraph summary of what Foss was looking for and why I thought the firm should respond carefully. I saved the email chain as a PDF to a folder on my personal laptop. Then I opened contributions.txt and added a new line. Gerald Foss, first contact November 11th. My response. My summary. My forward. The introduction Aldridge made was apparently me. I sat with that for a long time. Outside, I could hear Marco in my father's office, already on the phone with someone, confident voice, easy laugh, the sound of a man who had never had to wonder whether the room knew he was there. I opened a new document on my laptop and began building the due diligence timeline for 3 simultaneous commercial transactions, because someone was going to have to do it, and I already knew it was going to be me. The investor meeting was scheduled for a Thursday at 2 in the afternoon, 3 weeks after my father's firm meeting. Gerald Foss was flying in from Phoenix with his business partner, a woman named Carol Whitman, who handled their due diligence internally. My father had booked the conference room at a hotel downtown, neutral ground, he said, more professional than the Victorian for a first in-person. I had built the entire due diligence package. Not because anyone asked me to. Because I had been watching the timeline my father and Marco were assembling, and I could see the gaps in it the way you can see a crack in a wall when you know what you're looking at. Their version had the right headings and the wrong sequencing. The inspection windows for all 3 properties overlapped in the second week of December, which meant one title officer handling 3 simultaneous orders at the holidays, which meant delays, which meant Foss Capital's first quarter target would slip before anyone noticed why. I had restructured the timeline. I had staggered the inspection windows. I had drafted a 1-page risk summary for each property, cross-referenced with county permit histories, and compiled everything into a single presentation binder, 3 copies, tabbed, with a cover page that said Navarro Property Group, Portfolio Due Diligence Summary, Q1 Acquisition. I brought the binders to the hotel. My father saw me in the lobby with them and stopped walking. "What is that?" he said. "Due diligence package," I said. The timeline had a sequencing problem. I fixed it. He looked at the binders. Then he looked at me. "I told you Marco was handling investor relations." Marco's timeline would have given Foss Capital a bottleneck in the second week of December, I said. All 3 inspection windows overlapping, 1 title officer, holidays. They'd miss the first quarter close. My father's jaw tightened. "We can adjust as we go. Or we can hand them a package that shows we already saw the problem and solved it." There was a silence. Marco was standing 6 feet behind my father, looking at his phone. My father said, "Leave the binders with the front desk. I'll look at them after." I said okay. I did not leave the binders with the front desk. Gerald Foss and Carol Whitman arrived at 2:03. Gerald was taller than I had expected from the email exchange, mid-60s, gray at the temples, the kind of deliberate handshake that told you he had been in rooms like this for 40 years. Carol was 50-something, sharp-eyed, carrying a leather notebook she opened before she sat down. My father made the introductions. He introduced my mother. He introduced Marco. He introduced Pilar, who was there to take notes. He did not introduce me. I was sitting at the far end of the table with the 3 binders in front of me. Carol Whitman looked down the table at me. "And you are?" My father said, "That's Daniela. She keeps things running for us." Gerald Foss looked at me. Something in his expression shifted, not dramatically, just a small recalibration, the kind a person makes when they recognize something. "Daniela," he said. "Did you handle the initial correspondence for the firm? Last November?" "Yes," I said. "I thought so," he said. "Your summary was the reason we decided to reach out further." My father said, "Gerald, we're glad the fit was clear from the start." "What's in those binders?" Carol Whitman said. She was looking at the stack in front of me. I looked at my father. He said nothing. I slid 1 binder across the table toward Gerald Foss and 1 toward Carol Whitman. I kept the 3rd. "Due diligence package," I said. "Portfolio summary, staggered inspection timeline, per property risk flags cross-referenced with county permit records, and a proposed escrow sequencing plan for the first quarter close." Carol opened her copy. She turned to the timeline page. She ran her finger down it. "You staggered the inspection windows," she said. "Yes." The original sequencing had all 3 overlapping in mid-December. One title officer holiday slowdown, you'd have missed the Q1 target by 3 to 4 weeks. Carol looked at Gerald. Gerald was reading the risk summary for the first property. The HVAC flag on the Midtown building, he said, without looking up. Is this based on county permit records? Yes. No permit activity on the system since 2007. It's original equipment. I'd recommend a mechanical inspection independent of the general inspection before you commit to that parcel. Gerald set the binder down flat on the table and looked at my father. Ernesto, he said. Who have we actually been working with here? My father's hand was resting on the table. I watched his fingers close slowly. Daniela supports the team, he said. Gerald said. She identified our contact point, wrote the initial summary that brought us to the table, built the due diligence package, and just caught a timeline error that would have cost us a quarter. He paused. That's not support. That's the operation. The room was quiet. Carol had not looked up from the binder. She turned to the escrow sequencing page. My father said, we work as a team. Everyone contributes. Gerald looked at me. What's your title? Administrative coordinator, I said. Gerald looked at my father again. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. We broke for 10 minutes after the binders. Gerald and Carol stepped into the hallway. My father pulled Marco and my mother to the far corner of the room in a low, tightly controlled conversation I could not hear but did not need to. I refilled the water glasses. When Gerald and Carol returned, the meeting continued for another 40 minutes. Carol asked most of the technical questions. I answered them. My father answered the relationship questions, history of the firm, prior transaction volume, regional relationships. It was the cleanest division of labor we had ever managed, and it happened without anyone naming it. At the end, Gerald said he wanted to move forward. He wanted a revised engagement letter. He wanted Daniela listed on the transaction team. My father said he would have something to them by end of week. On the drive back to the Victorian, I rode with my mother. She didn't speak until we were 2 blocks from the office. Then she said, "You should have told your father you were building that package." I looked out the window at the late afternoon light on the saguaros along the road. I told him the timeline had a sequencing problem, I said. He told me to leave the binders at the front desk. My mother said nothing after that. The conversation with my father happened that evening in the back office after everyone else had left. He was at his desk. The leather portfolio was in front of him. He had his hands flat on the table on either side of it, like he was studying something. I sat in the chair across from him. He said, "That was not the way to handle it, Daniela." I said, "I know you want to talk about the meeting. I want to talk about something else first." He looked at me. I said, "Gerald Foss didn't come to us through Aldridge." A pause. Short but real. I said, "He emailed the general contact address on a Tuesday in November." I responded. I sent him the capability summary. I answered his follow-up questions. I wrote a 3-paragraph summary and forwarded it to you. I'm the introduction you described to Aldridge. My father said, "I simplified it for the room." "You removed me from it," I said. He started to speak. I said, "I want to say some things and I'd like you to let me finish." He settled back. I opened the folder I had carried in. Not the portfolio, my own folder, plain manila from my desk. Inside, a printed copy of the Gerald Foss email chain, the Saguaro Commons escrow timeline with my name on the file header, the Scottsdale presentation packet, the revised lease template with my track changes signature. I set the papers on the table one at a time. "You told me the night Warren Pruitt came to the house that I had jumped in too much," I said. "That it could come across as too much when I answered the technical questions. What I was actually doing was saving a client relationship that would have walked out the door if someone hadn't explained the watershed ordinance." My father's expression was still. "At the Scottsdale conference," I said, "you spoke from memory. The 40-slide deck and the talking points document I built stayed in your bag. I found the folder in the recycling bin. The binding was still sealed." I touched the printed conference packet. "What I was actually doing that night was staying until 11:30 so that you would have everything you needed in case you needed it." I slid the Foss email chain forward. "You told Gerald and Carol that Aldridge made this introduction," I said. "What I was actually doing 11 weeks ago was responding to a cold inquiry, qualifying it, writing the summary that made them decide to move forward, and forwarding it to you with a recommendation. I was the introduction. I just didn't have my name on it. I set the last document down. You told me today in the lobby to leave the binders at the front desk, I said. What I was actually doing was protecting a $4.8 million deal from a sequencing error that would have cost your investors a full quarter. Gerald Foss told you what that was worth. He used the word operation. My father looked at the papers on the table. He did not pick any of them up. I'm not asking you to apologize, I said. I'm asking you to put my name on the transaction team in the engagement letter. The way Gerald asked. The silence lasted long enough that I could hear the HVAC unit cycling on in the ceiling. My father said, "You should have come to me first. With the package. Before the meeting." "I came to you in the lobby," I said. "You told me to leave it at the front desk." He looked at the portfolio. Then at the papers. Then, slowly, he nodded. One time. I squared the edges of my folder, stood up, and walked out of the office. I did not close the door hard. I pulled it to with one hand, felt the latch catch, and kept walking. The engagement letter went to Gerald Foss on Friday. My name was on it. Transaction Coordinator, Daniela Navarro. Not Administrative Coordinator. Not keeps things running for us. My father had made the change without discussion, just a revised draft in my inbox on Thursday evening with a note that said review before I send. I reviewed it. I sent it. The Foss Capital portfolio closed in February, inside the first quarter window. The staggered inspection timeline held. The Midtown building came back with the HVAC flag I had identified. Gerald negotiated a seller credit of $140,000 on the strength of the mechanical inspection I had recommended. Carol Whitman sent me a handwritten note afterward on her firm's letterhead that said you were right about the equipment. Thank you for the catch. I kept the note in my desk drawer. Not in the portfolio. In my own drawer, in my own file. My father never said the word sorry. I did not expect him to. There is a particular kind of man who shows you he heard something not by speaking but by quietly adjusting the thing he got wrong, and that is the version of acknowledgement I got, a revised engagement letter, a changed title, a deal that closed the way I said it would close. It was not the same as being seen. But it was a beginning, and I had learned by then that beginnings were the part one was good at. What I understand now that I did not understand at 21 during the database summer is that invisibility is not the same as insignificance. I had confused the two for years. I thought that if the people around me could not see what I was doing, it meant the work was worth less than work that got named. It took a man from Phoenix who had read 3 paragraphs I wrote in a general contact inbox to say out loud what my own father had not said in 4 years. There are people who will look at everything you have built and call it support. And there are people who will look at the same thing and call it the operation. The difference is not in what you built. The difference is in what the person looking at it needs from you. The thing I would say to anyone in that position, still doing the work, still holding the room together, still watching someone else get the introduction, is this: keep the folder. Keep contributions.txt. Keep the record of what you actually did and when you did it, not because you will need it for revenge, but because there will come a day when someone asks you to prove it, and you will want to be the person in the room who already has the answer. The leather portfolio is still on my father's credenza. I still replace the legal pad inside it when it runs out. Some things change slowly and some things are still changing. If this story reminded you of someone who does the invisible work in your life, share it with them. Sometimes the best thing you can give a person is the words for something they already knew. This story is a work of fiction. All names, characters, businesses, and events are products of the imagination and used entirely for entertainment purposes. Any resemblance to actual persons or events is coincidental.